Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is my guest, J.R. Nyquist, returning again to our weekly show. Last week, we just, had various projects that we were working on, so apologize for not having a show last week, but here we are. And we're going to be talking about issues related to geopolitics and national security. How you doing, Jeff?
Doing okay. How are you doing, Nevin?
Good, 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 good. I can't complain. Yeah, I wanted to circle back to a blog posting that you did last month. And one of your many avid readers, he is a blogger himself. I recommend it along with several others, the Contemplative Observer. You can find it on the World Wide Web, where he documents, provides a plethora of documentation on why Russia is fundamentally a Soviet country, and details, of course, communist subversion throughout the world. I recommend that blog, along with, of course, Jeff Nyquist's blog. And he wrote something very interesting about a mother-daughter duo who, after the Berlin Wall partially opened on November 9th, 1989, they went through the border crossing between East Germany and West Germany at Helmstedt-Marienborn. And they went into, her name was Dr. Anne-Marie Reffert, and she was interviewed on West German television.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, the interviewer said, "Are you planning to smell Western air, so to speak, more often in the near future?" And then she responded, "Yes, perhaps for visiting, just so as to take a view of your way of life, but never for good. You know, you are an entirely different society, and I have no inclination to live with you. For visiting, yes." And that quote was startling. Not entirely surprising, but startling, because over time, from the research that I've conducted, I've found that you have people for many, many different reasons, whether they're former soldiers, intelligence officers, bureaucrats, what have you, party members, who really love communism. They feel connected to the system. They're willing to fight for it. They're saying, hey, don't underestimate us. We're willing to fight. We really believe in it, or there are other reasons, maybe more latent reasons behind that. So when I reread that to you, what comments do you have about that? What are some of your initial reactions?
Well, look, like the Communist Party Soviet Union, what was it? You had over 30 million members, something like that. And of course, that's a huge number of people, but those are the members. Now think about their family members, their children, their cousins, their brothers and sisters, parents. Think of the people. Now, some of those people would be party members too, but you're really with extended family. You're talking about 60, 70 million people who actually look at the system as our system. And of course, if you've got in the Soviet Union, you have 300 million people when it was at its height. So you suddenly you can get toward this number of 25 or 30%. 30% is regime stability. 30% of the people support your regime. It doesn't matter what the other 70% think. It seems to be this magic number, and social scientists have talked about this magic number. You look at the American Revolution. You had a third of the people for the revolution, a third for the king, a third didn't care, and the third that wanted the revolution, they won the Revolutionary War. And then a lot of the Tories, they went to Canada, right? This is where we get English Canada from. So that was the American Revolution. So there's this numbers game where you just have to buy up a certain amount of support, give advantages for living, give advantages for education, give advantages for relationships. And so these regimes, I've had people in Eastern Europe tell me, look, and it's true, in Romania and Poland and places where they've had governments that weren't friendly to Moscow, this nomenclatura, right, these special people, they're still there. They're dominant in the media, and I've been told this again and again. They're dominant in big business in those countries still because those were controlled by the Communist Party before. And that was just 30 years ago. So it wasn't like the communist families divested, they ended up controlling much of the thing. And then the major political parties under their control, which, before it was a communist party, now they're social democrats or Democrats. The Italian Communist Party is now the Democratic Party in Italy. I mean, our Communist Party kind of bled into the Democratic Party, right? They took it over from the inside. If you listen to what Trevor Loudon says, and I heard communists in the early 80s saying, we're taking over the Democratic Party, we're going to control it through its left wing. So what people don't understand about communist systems is it isn't true that there's like one guy solid at the top and they got these mean people with machine guns killing anybody that doesn't do for them. There is broad support for the regime, not majority support, because the majority is miserable, but broad enough support that you have people who will fight for it and will kill for it. And that's what makes the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of East Germany, the fall of the Warsaw Pact countries such a curiosity when you go down into the details and you find, I get emails from people in the Czech Republic, Slovakia. Look at who won the elections in Slovakia. Look at what happened in Poland. You have powerful interest. I don't believe that Tusk, I don't believe that the people in Poland who are coming into power now are going to be as anti-Russian as you people think. I don't think Biden is anti-Russian, as he likes to portray. Did you see the Times piece about the journalist who followed President Zelensky's trip here to the U.S. in late September? And he went back to Kiev and he talked to them. He talked to some of Zelensky's advisors. Well, how does Zelensky feel about his trip to see Biden, his trip to America? He's angry. That was the Biden, because Biden basically is going to cut him off. I think Biden is using the GOP as cover because the Republicans aren't a majority for it anymore. And so the Democrats have a large enough number that just a handful of Republicans, they could make this vote happen, but they can't. What's happened? I don't think in terms of the political elites in this country, I think we have in the United States, a proto-totalitarian elite that's been forming out of our education strata, out of the universities, out of these professions like teaching and publishing and entertainment, where you've had this tremendous pressure to be woke. I think we're getting to the point where they can form a totalitarian regime here in the United States.
Well, that's interesting. I came across, and I talked about I don't know if you intentionally mentioned this to elicit a piece of information I stumbled upon. I was doing some research and I found it was dated from, I always like my citations so people know that I'm credible. It's in a editorial called Analyzing Youth in the Richmond Times-Dispatch dated July 7th, 1971. Mm-hmm. And I was researching something called the Pal Memorandum, which was purportedly a blueprint for corporate control of the American government. And of course, I like to look at there was one piece in the former Justice Pal's files that intrigued me. Is interesting statistics. A National Review sponsored a poll in 1971 of youth on 12 American college campuses. It found half of the students favored the socialization of all basic U.S. industries. 54% of the students polled chose surrendering to the Soviet Union instead of fighting, God forbid, a world war with them. Not a preemptive American war, that if the Soviets invaded Eastern Europe or sent troops elsewhere and we got into a war, 54% of the students would say, just let's surrender the United States if they were invading the United States, is what it meant. So a Gallup poll found that 21% of American students maintain negative opinions of NATO. So when you fast forward Um, I hate to be a monopolizer here. During the 1980s, you had John Trink noted there is a renaissance of Marxist studies underway. No doubt at least part of the reason for the revival of interest in Marx is many of the student radicals of the 1960s are now the Marxist professors of the 1980s. Marxist critiques are written and thousands of students required to read the old masters. Now, there's more I can read to you, but I think those are very
Well, I
telling.
went to
It kind
college
of
in the
doesn't it feed it?
1980s.
Does it kind of does this sound familiar and surprise you? I think this
No,
kind of backs
well,
up what you're saying.
you know,
What do you
for
think?
younger people, you had the 60s where you had a lot of sort of radical activism against the Vietnam War on campuses. And then in the 1970s, you know, they got rid of the draft. There was no Vietnam War. Americans weren't. And all of a sudden, that just died out on college campuses. And I think I'm tail end baby boom. And we looked at the older baby boomers, and we kind of, we didn't trust them. We didn't like it. I was born in 1958. I think our group didn't feel that way exactly. So there was a different atmosphere on campus in the late 70s. Um, but then in the 80s, this was coming in. They were wanting to really take over. A lot of these young radicals in the 60s were becoming professors. And and by the late 80s, there was this unification of the old left and the new left in academia. And this is where wokeism and a lot of these ideas were starting to percolate into the universities. And they were reading, just to be specific, they weren't reading Das Kapital, at least and I was at UC Irvine, they were getting people to read the early Marx. And a lot of that has to do with this guy here, Gramsci. This is Karl Bogg's, Gramsci's Marxism. And they were having people. This is the prison notebooks here of Gramsci, prison notebooks. And of course, Gramsci was an Italian communist. He had he had been trained in Moscow. He spent a lot of time in prison. I think he died in 1937, if I'm remembering right. And he looked at communism, and he said, look, Marx left some big holes. Marx didn't really figure out everything. And so what we need to do to make this revolution work is we need to break down religion. We need to break down the family. We need to create and encourage new lifestyles. We have to go use culture, have a culture approach. Now, he wasn't promoting homosexuality, and of course people would consider him quite conservative in his actual personal views, but you could see how they could look at Gramsci and say, well, why not go beyond what he was saying? Because Gramsci was saying, why not take Marx and go beyond what we're saying and make war not just about class, but make it about race and sex, male versus female, feminism, and make it about homosexuality versus heterosexuality, and use that to undermine religion. Because if you say, look, what is the teachings of the Catholic Church, of the Protestant churches, is like fornication is bad, divorce is bad, stay married to the same person, mom stays at home and raises the kids, these kind of traditional values. Well, if you can promote feminism, if you can promote free love, or have sex with whoever you want, do whatever you want, whatever feels good, you are basically breaking down the family. And you are now saying, well, religion, we don't obey, we don't follow that anymore, because we want to have sex, with the cat or whatever. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, you know what I'm saying. We want to
Right.
leave the bounds of, we want to experience these new things. And hedonism, this is where my criticism of the market society is the market society successful? Market society makes people more hedonistic. And not only more hedonistic, that breaks down religion and breaks down inhibitions and breaks down the family, but also then in their choices, their political choices, they're hedonistic. They make their political choices based on what feels good. So suddenly Reagan, who's a conservative, comes in and says it's morning in America. Well, that feels good. And Trump comes in and says, make America great again. Well, and then everything seems quite easy. You just elect Trump and everything's great again. But it really doesn't work that way, because it turns out there's got to be some kind of social discipline. People have to, within themselves, they have to go, wait a minute, I'm kind of lazy, I'm lax, I don't have the strong work ethic, I'm not moral, I'm not true to my wife or my husband, or I've had 5 divorces, whatever, or I'm I'm sort of disgusting. And so the thing is that you do have this unwinding of the old-fashioned virtues. People had to be very tough. Now they're very soft, right? And so what happens now, we all have to be given all these social welfare benefits. The government has to take care of us and coddle us, and so that's what we're now expecting. But what's happening to the government? It's going broke. The economy's going broke. And people are believing in these more and more neurotic, crazy things like, oh, the planet's going to overheat and we're going to all die if we don't stop driving cars and having power plants. And we have to have all electric cars, and we can't have this power infrastructure because it's going to kill us. So now they're saying by 2040, our power infrastructure is going to collapse because they're not going to allow us to use coal, and they're not going to allow us, you know what I'm saying? So it gets crazier and crazier the more weak inwardly we are, where we have no boundaries. People have no respect. They don't know how to have a conversation without disrespecting the other person. I can make a strong argument, but my goodness, what people will do is they'll get personal with you, right? They'll say really disrespectful things, which 100 years ago somebody would have slugged you in the face, or further back they would have challenged you to a duel, or they would have just hauled off and killed you in the Middle Ages.
Sure.
And the thing is, that's where good manners were invented, right? When you had hand-to-hand combat and people would challenge you to a duel, people had amazing manners. But now these people, they feel like they're equal. They don't have respect. They're slovenly. Now, this is the thing Ortega said about Spain before the Spanish Civil War. He said the teachers are slovenly towards the students. He was talking about the Spanish universities. The students are slovenly toward the teachers. The country's slovenly. Everybody's become slovenly. And of course, look at the Holocaust. I shouldn't use that word. Look at the loss of life, the catastrophe that was the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. The amount of people killed from that sort of slovenliness that Ortega y Gasset wrote about in his book on the university. So I think we're there. I think we are Spain. We're like Spain before the Spanish Civil War.
Well, yeah, I mean, this country is politically polarized. That's very true, in the worst possible way. I mean, there's definitely some overlap with what you're saying, and there are definitely things that I have some differences, but I think we reached the same conclusion that the country internally is weakened. It is extremely divided. I wanted to circle back now. As most of the viewers know, I tend to take more of a center-left view on social issues. I tend to be accepting and whatnot. I'm not saying you're not, obviously, but
accepting of what?
Accepting of differing people, minorities, LGBTQ, right, and whatnot.
I'm not
going to make it into a debate.
I'm not saying anything about. I'm not advocating racism. I'm talking about hedonism. I'm talking about and it doesn't matter what it's the hedonism of doing what feels good, right?
Right. And I wanted to circle back into something you may be familiar with it, and more for the benefit of the audience too as well. Alexandra Kollontai, who is the Soviet People's Commissar for Social Welfare, as you were talking about the issues of extreme feminism and extreme sexual libertinism, and the communist usage of that, it made me think of this. And she was the People's Commissar for Social Welfare and the founders of the Women's Department of the Bolshevik regime. And she wrote in 1921, you could access this at Marxist.org, primary sources. She said, only a code of sexual morality that is in harmony with the problems of the working class can serve as an important weapon in strengthening the working class's fighting position. Kollontai believed that the, quote, rejection of the element of submission in marriage and the, quote, greater fluidity in relationships between the sexes are key components in the struggle to bring down what she derided as, quote, the bourgeois family. And she argues once the bourgeois family was dissolved, capitalism would be eradicated. Now let's circle a little bit forward here, because I want to kind of make a point that communists, the issues, as David Horowitz, I have my issues with him like you, but he had recalled that the SDS radicals at the time would say the issue is not the issue is revolution. Now I forward to recent years, a CPUSA operative, Norma Markowitz, in the Communist Party publication, condemned the gay right activist Mattachine Society for, quote, internal red baiting in the 1950s. And she condemned the society for allowing mainstream liberal and conservative gays to hijack it in favor of American patriotism. According to Markowitz, by 1969, the gay left considered the Mattachine Society to be, quote, the artifact with establishment pretensions, something like a conservative AFL business union to labor militants, with the National Urban League to black militants. When you start to put all this research together, really and truly the communist leadership, they don't give a flipping fig Newton about rights and acceptance. They want to use these people who are, quote, oppressed or mistreated, right, or whatever, as tools, as a battering ram to totally destroy the system.
I think there's no doubt, and I think a lot of gay people are intelligent about this, that they know that the left doesn't really care about them, that they're just using them to attack Christianity, or for their own political purpose. Look, the thing is that J.D. Unwin, Engels wrote a book on the family, and he was using Marx's notes, and he was sort of suggesting a kind of society that you see when you offer welfare, when the state becomes sort of the daddy to all the moms, and women don't need husbands anymore. He was talking about if I recall right, the Iroquois, or how families work when the man there's no patriarchy. And of course, this attack on the patriarchy, it very much stems from a sort of a Marxist analysis. And of course, I don't think there's been any successful civilization or society or empire that didn't have patriarchy. Now, you can criticize, I'm not suggesting that men suppress women or sell their children into slavery. If they're bad, sell them to the circus, so to speak. But J.D. Unwin, who was a British anthropologist who was writing in the 1920s, well, a 1934 book he wrote was called Sex and Culture. And I read a bit of it this past week because somebody brought it up to me. And he goes through 5 civilizations: the Sumerians, the Babylonians, Persia, Egypt, and he looked at their marital laws. And what he found was that when they were strong and vibrant as cultures, and also militarily successful, they had monogamy with male-led families, patriarchy. And when when the role between when that male dominance started to weaken, the society started to weaken. He made the point that some of these societies, it could be rather harsh on children and women, and he said that it's so harsh that people don't like it, so it's going to change. He said you're not going to be able to keep society, people kind of almost enslaved, make your children into your private slave army, and your wife is completely your slave. that isn't going to, it never seems to last very long, because people say, look, this is not reasonable, right? The women end up saying no. The children end up becoming, I mean, what are you going to do? They're your family. You're really going to kill them? You know, you're really going to beat them to death? It doesn't work. So what happens is that something about that patriarchy in these civilizations, it does break down. But then it's funny, the society sort of comes unraveled to some degree, to a degree that the family structure breaks down. So that it's kind of interesting. It's controversial because it's a complicated subject, because it's not, the marriage and the family is important, but it's not the only thing that's going on that determines, you know, there's religion, there's the economy, there's all kinds of interplay here. But that's just one book. And people, I noticed some people on Christian Right are digging this book up now and are reading it. But because they're looking for sociological or anthropological arguments to somehow save the family. But there is a degree of social anarchy here in our country.
Yeah, now moving on to the issue of communism today, um, you know, when I read that posting, that contribution by Contemplative Observer, it made me reflect on research, as I mentioned earlier. Um, and before we go on that one point, I wanted to mention I was not implying that you were not accepting or liberal-minded or whatnot. People, when we talk about highly sensitive situations like it, yeah, I feel the need, especially since this is YouTube, and I got struck once before because we had a prior conversation. We have to be very careful, and I have to be very specific in my critiques and bring up specific documentation which clearly illustrates really what's going on and what we're thinking and whatnot.
Right. I mean, look, I'm
We're
just
living
talking
in a world of
about
extreme
hedonism, right?
correctness. Sorry.
Which is, you know, I'm just talking about a feel-good society hedonism, market hedonism,
Yeah.
which is something I wrote about in the origins of the Fourth World War. And of course, if, you know, people have written about this before, like the book Entertaining Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, is that the sensuality of the visual medium of television, you know, and Marshall McLuhan saying the medium is the message, is that people, it's like a feast for the eyes to watch a movie, to watch these TV things. They're just very mesmerizing. And you enter into a different state. It's not an active state, and it's not the same as reading, which requires effort and thought, and it sort of develops you. So we've passed from this literate culture to a culture that sort of enjoys this entertainment. And you know, thus his book, "Amusing Ourselves to Death," actually is the title. And so that is a problem when you have a republic, when most of the citizens, you know, self-discipline, self-control is a key aspect of the society actually functioning. People getting up, going to work, doing difficult jobs, going to school a long time, delaying gratification. You know, this is how our society has advanced so far. And you know, if Max Weber was correct in his Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, Protestantism had something to do with that, right? And you could say that the same thing in Catholic countries, that Catholic morality, holding the family together, and that once you break that, look at the birth rate, how it's fallen. And I was fascinated to see that in the Soviet Union, part of the problem is that, you know, women who have children get money from the state, not necessarily if they have a husband, right? Sounds familiar, right? And you know, the average Soviet, towards the end of the Soviet Union, the average Soviet woman had 7 abortions. And this is, you know, and in China we know the one-child policy. This incredible tragedy, but now look at how the birth rate in China is collapsing. They're having a demographic collapse in China. We're having a demographic collapse in the West. Maybe Islam is the Islamic world is not, But this is a very sort of scary thing because we don't have what would you call it? We don't have a set of accepted rules anymore. Where we used to have folk ways that you could define, you could say, well, this is the way the Americans are, and the French and the Germans and the different countries, and you would see the role of Protestantism or Catholicism or Judaism. But now it's hard to know what is going to happen next, right? And we don't even defend ourselves. I mean, we haven't built a nuclear weapon since 1992, and I bring this up over and over again. What is the relationship between our view, all these individuals' views of their responsibility to the future and to defend themselves and to recognize that we have enemies, versus just have a good time?
Oh yeah, and that's an interesting. This is a very interesting point. It's all interesting points you make. And to circle to contemplative observers' point, I would caution against underestimating the commitment of at least a portion of the populations of our geopolitical enemies. And here's an interesting one. There's a book called North Korea Under Communism, Report of an Envoy to Paradise by Eric Cornell, written in 2002, where he was a North Korean interpreter. He interviews a North Korean interpreter, and he traveled to the Scandinavian countries, and he came to reveal the deep scorn he felt for these societies, which were characterized by a lack of discipline and determination. This is this North Korean interpreter. He saw sloppiness everywhere in the clumsy border controls and the crowds of people that obviously did not make work a priority, in the confusing traffic and the lack of a police and military presence on the streets, and much besides, all things that for us are indicative of a civilized and democratic society. The terrorist attack and the blowing up of the West German embassy in Stockholm seemed to him almost to be a hopeful sign of the times and a natural phase in the anti-imperialist struggle, and it was also significant that the sloppy state had been unable to present such actions. He did not touch upon questions of living standards because, like all communists, he compared capitalism's existing production capacity with the future promise of socialism. It's a very revealing quote. What do you make of that in light of what you had previously stated in our discussion?
Well, it's interesting when you were, you know, he's talking about, he's coming from a society with sanguinary discipline in North Korea, that if you break the rules, you go to a camp and you probably die. You get less rations, you starve to death. It's a horrible system, right? And it's not a fair system, but it's an extreme. The discipline is carried on through peer pressure by the Communist Party and by force, using force on people. So there are two kinds of discipline, and I'm thinking this isn't exact, but you're familiar with the book The Lonely Crowd?
No.
David Reisman and Nathan Glazer. This was written around 1950. This is a classic in sociology. It's a very important book in a lot of ways, and he talked about inner-directed people and outer-directed people. And this relates to Weber too, in the Protestant ethic, is that you have behavior that's either driven by things outside of you, like the peer group pressure. In the case of The Lonely Crowd, he was observing that television was brand new and radio were having these effects on younger people, where their value system and what they thought was okay to do, right or wrong, how they thought was being conditioned by these cues, which was, you want to be attractive, you want your peers to respect you. Oh, everybody's using this, everybody's using this product. This was being used in advertising. But whereas before this commercial situation arose, people were inner directed. So as the outer directed person and the inner directed. And the inner directed was, you were taught certain right and wrong, certain rules that became yours, that became part of how you lived in the world. And so you knew this right from wrong. You did it without anybody looking over your shoulder. You were honest. You showed up to work on time. You didn't lie. You didn't cheat. Excuse me. And but with these commercial values and the market taking over and media, now we're mediating the values. The values were not coming from this inner sort of integration of classical right and wrong. It was coming from, this is going to make you cool. You're going to be cool because you're going to have this product, or you're going to listen to this music, or you're going to wear these clothes or have this kind of car. And of course, I think if it would be interesting if they had done North Korea or China. You have these societies, which of course you've got this draconian communist hierarchy controlling the society, pouring in these ideas into people's heads, and the people are all looking. They use a lot of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner type stuff. It was Pavlov and his dogs. The bell rings, and you stand up and you salute the communist flag, and you goose step and you fight for the motherland, the Rodina, as the Soviets would say. But it was somebody was programming you, and it isn't the real right and wrong, so that you have dissidents who were people who say, no, this is a violation. The system is a violation. And so you had, that's totalitarianism had its own way of doing it. But within the ruling parties, the people in those ruling parties, it was about power and about being part of this elite. And for many, it was join the party and get the privilege and get the education.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and I posted this on your site in the comments section also last month, 2023. And what's interesting is that these individuals being stationed in Western societies, the notions of freedom or social democracy or Anglo-American capitalism or whatever, it doesn't faze them. They're not they're not fazed. It's not lost on them. It's not like they're won over. They really truly believe, either through brainwashing or perhaps other factors that we could explore, that they're really attached to totalitarianism. And I think
and if it works for you, if you get advantages out of it, yeah, I believe in it, right? Because I benefit from it.
Or they seriously, regardless, believe in it. They feel their societies are superior and disciplined and militaristic, and we feel that we're a collective spirit. I mean, humans crave individualism, but they also do crave this sense of belonging. And in my study of totalitarianism, like Mr. Meyer's book, They Thought They Were Free, which interviewed people in Western Germany after the fall of the Third Reich, and of course the things that I've shared on your website and shared on the show, it's frightening. And the scary thing, to circle it back, and I think you brought up some good points, which got into a very productive discussion on the communist exploitation of the various minorities, including LGBTQ and feminism and all the rest of it. It's not dead here. And there are literally totalitarian minds here at work in the United States. And I think you and I would argue, I certainly suspect that they're in government. I'm not trying to sound like a paranoid kook. I mean, you have somebody like former Congressman Ronald Dellums, and his successor and former staff member Barbara Lee is currently Congresswoman. And you have various communist parties and extreme socialist parties like DSA, which recently, as I talked about with Trevor Loudon when I had him on the show, as well as talked about with you, where DSA has even alienated some good progressives, even from one in the upper areas of Bronx, in the Riverdale Bronx in New York City, I think his name is Congressman Torres. They have alienated these progressives because really the DSA has showed themselves to be out and out communists in their support for the totalitarians of Hamas. So really the mask is dropping. I actually went on Twitter. I have a Twitter account. And I basically trolled the DSA and I said, guys, the mask is off. You know what they responded back to me? They said, the mask has always been off.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and you know, and unfortunately, you know, and look, you know, at heart, I'm an old school Republican from like 50, 60 years ago when it comes to economics, and old school Democrat of the Scoop Jackson variety on most aspects of foreign policy, is certainly domestic policy. I think he had a good pro-American progressivism. Um, the more I've read and researched his positions. But when you look at the Democratic Party today, the DSA has infiltrated them. In Texas, the DSA said they want to have one leg in the leg out in the streets and the other leg inside the Democratic Party, which is also what Gus Hall wrote in his book, A Lame Duck in Turbulent Waters, published in 1972, that one of the operating legs was within the liberal wing of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
So totalitarianism exists, just as the old documentary, The Seductive Illusion, which came out in 1989. The Seductive Illusion, one of the interviewees had a point. He said just because a Communist Party is small numerically does not mean that it doesn't exert tremendous influence, and it doesn't mean that it can't be a threat to the system. And to take an extreme example, and I'd like you to give your points on what I said or counterpoints. In 1917, the Bolshevik Party had no more than 200,000 members. Russia had a population of 91 million people. You never know if a small movement, as long as they have very capable organizers, and Lenin and his comrades were brilliant organizers. I recommend people even read snippets of his works, like What Is to Be Done and others that talk about revolutionary agitation and how to be an efficient agitator. Um, the country can go economically downhill. I mean, you and I might have differing or similar opinions on why it would take place, but I think you and I agree that it's a possibility. And those 200,000 people, if they're led by capable organizers, that could be severe problems, especially if we're in a wartime situation. And it seems like we're marching or being pushed into a wartime situation. What is your reaction to that? Am I a paranoid anti-communist that thinks the enemy is 100 feet tall, or am I
Well,
concerned?
Lenin was getting money through the Bank of Siberia, through Denmark, from the German government. It was during World War I. Germany wanted Russia to be knocked out of the war. If they'd had the February Revolution, Kerensky's government was in power. They had elections were going to happen, and Kerensky was going to make Russia a democracy and keep it on the side of the Allies in World War I. And if Lenin could overthrow that government, it could be a game changer. And then Lenin, of course, in in gratitude to Germany, would sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and get Russia out of the war. This was the kind of deal that was really going on behind the scenes that nobody could see at the time, in real time, that that's what was going on. So Lenin was financed by a very strong and determined foreign power. And as you said, he was a minority, but you got to remember the environment he was working in was chaos. People were starving. People were against the war. The government's policy of keeping Russia in the war was unpopular. So you had a combination of things where Lenin could say bread and peace. And actually, even though he had this small group, he had a popular slogan. And that's
Exactly.
one of the reasons he was so successful. But as far as here in the United States, it's very strange because, we're a prosperous society, and their slogans are, global warming, and wokeness. And those are kind of like, for a society that we're very comfortable. We don't think anything bad's going to happen to us. We don't understand there's consequences for these policies. And a lot of it is, when you are talking about LGBTQ, or you're talking about more sexual freedom for people, you are appealing. You're really saying, do what feels good, and that's what matters the most. And that is sort of popular, right? If people are becoming, and if you're highly organized, and then but what's ironic is the whole basis of the comfort of all these people actually is the capitalist system. Ultimately, the free market system. But if you're going to destroy that system, if you're going to plunder it, if you're going to tax it to death, if you're going to turn off the power because power is heating electricity is you don't want people to have it anymore. You don't want them to drive cars or have an internal combustion engine. Suddenly, you are now transforming it towards Russia, where everybody's poor and desperate, and nobody knows where their bread's coming from. And now you turn the game the other way around, and you've got wars going on. So then you say bread and peace, and then you play Lenin's game.
Right, of course. And we could definitely, probably into an hour, and probably have a discussion and even a little bit of a debate, of course, too, as well. I would argue, of course, our economic system, I think the height of prosperity, of course, from about roughly the mid 1940s until about the 1970s, it was the golden age of American capitalism, and our system back then was very different. It was reformed. We were enjoying the fruits of tariff protection. There was strong, mostly anti-communist union protections. There was balance, where it was really possible for the man to stay home or the woman to stay home and to demand to work, and all the rest of it. I could go on and on and on and on and on with all these different reforms, and that stabilized.
And people were more 100 years ago, people were more religious than they are now.
Right, and that's
people were more and more. Look at the number of people. It's 30-something% of the American people go to church every Sunday. So that's not, 100 years ago, it was probably 80%, if not higher, of people went to church every Sunday. So it's a different country.
Yeah.
And, I guess my point is that you're going to have problems. And the thing about the left and the communists as a movement is they're always inventing things that are going to break your economy down, break the family down, break your internal order of the soul down. And it is like Eric Voegelin said, that Marxism is a metastatic faith, which means that they think that if they have the revolution, magically everything changes and everything's going to be great. They just have to break the back. They just have to murder enough people in the revolution, kill all the right people, and then that happens. And of course, that's like the Nazis saying, well, we just have to kill the Jews or the Gypsies or these certain set of people, wipe out all the aristocrats, or wipe out all the capitalists that aren't going to play ball with us. That's insane. It's basically insane.
Of course.
And that's basically where we've got that. That's an element in our politics already. And there's so many people that aren't very well educated who are falling for these new narratives. Anti-Semitism on the right is growing. On the left, you could see with this Hamas thing, it's growing. Anti-Semitism, it's been, described as the stupid man's communism, the stupid man's
socialism of the fools. I think it was Auguste Bebel who said it was the socialism of the fools.
Yeah.
They're termed anti-Semitism, and it's very toxic. Yes, oh yeah, in the United States, you had the testimony, you want to talk about the genocidal or murderous intentions of communist parties and movements. Look at what the Weather Underground, what Larry Grathwell said, where folks like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn and others would talking, and he was a witness to it, saying that over 25 million people would be liquidated, and you'd have these education camps for counter-revolutionaries, diehard capitalists, as they term. I mean, you and I and Trevor Loudon and other scholars have talked about it, and really what I stumbled upon, that history, my intention to, look over the Powell memo, and there are parts of it that I agree with on that, and part of it I don't agree with, obviously, as a populist, although I don't even like that term, to be honest with you, these days, for a whole host of reasons. But in 1971, 50% of people want the socialization of American industries. Now, the viewers of the show know I am a very searing white-hot critic of libertarianism and Reaganomics. Don't like it. But that is jarring. In 1971, 50% of students polled at 12 universities, and I do believe the National Review poll, despite my criticisms at times of that.
Well, thank
that's
goodness.
A lot of people, and it hasn't gotten better, Jeff, has it?
Well, I mean, no, Reagan came along and showed them that, the economy did get better. People saw in the 1970s, they thought that we were going down the tubes economically. And I think the problem is that you do have to have freedom, economic freedom, to get prosperity, to get growth. But there's other cultural factors, and there's religious factors, and there's social discipline. You have to have a rule of law. You can't have gangster capitalism. You can't have what they had in Russia, which in the 1990s. So you have to have the right mix, and freedom is an important. It's been said before that without that interdiscipline of having religious faith, and without having that spiritualization of the population, freedom could become a very negative thing.
Yeah, you have to have it. I don't think anybody on this show would debate, unless there are neo-fascist or communist trolls out there, and I'm sure there are, but I think also the term freedom, like social justice, gets misused. I think when I hear the word freedom being propounded by people like Stephen Moore or Scott Walker or Ted Cruz, what I think of is basically big business and private equity and other, what I would argue, bad elements within the capitalist system.
The thing is, elements within the bureaucracy. Look, what is more subject to corruption? Private business or government managed business? It's obvious. We look all around the world. Government management of business immediately causes massive corruption throughout the system, and every socialist system has this problem. It just becomes corrupt unless you've got Stalin out there executing people right and left to keep the discipline going. You have corruption.
But what I'm not advocating is socialism. Regulation and outlawing or not permitting certain things is not the same as socialism. Of course, that would be my counterpoint. It has to
regulate certain kinds of regulation. Yes, you have to have some laws, but when that regulation is actually, one of the problems is that once the government can intervene in the economy, now you've got large corporations lobbying to have it done in their favor.
Well, actually, large companies actually lobby for mergers and acquisitions, which is deregulation. Large companies advocated for the deregulation, like getting rid of Glass-Steagall, stock buybacks, and other policies, deregulation.
Well, they also can lobby for tax structures and things that destroy smaller businesses that are competing with them.
Well, sure, they have different tax laws, lowering of taxes on large corporations, and also allowing deregulation or the preventing of regulation on overseas tax shelters in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere too. So what I advocate, of course, there needs to be a balance. I mean, you can't have Obviously, I don't support regulation for regulation's sakes. You have to take a very historical approach, if you will, what works, what doesn't work. We have to decide as a governmental class, and I think this is where you make really an excellent point. You have to have leaders that are motivated by a sense of the public interest and a sense of the golden rule. And I think there are certain healthy traditions that you're pointing out that most decent Americans of whatever faith or persuasion can agree upon, something like the golden rule.
and that is, by
Because
the
this
way,
discussion you and
yeah,
I are having on what to regulate, not to regulate,
yeah,
it's going to be almost meaningless if you don't have the right governing
right.
class. And I think this is where you always make an excellent counterpoint or point to add on to this. And that's the problem.
Yeah, and of course, this is what we've talked about. What I've talked about before is that we don't have a class that performs the aristocratic function, which is the defensive. Aristocracy means the rule by the best people, but in Western civilization, means a class of people who actually take responsibility for defending society. They're the warrior class, so to speak, the silver class. And going back to Plato's Republic. So the problem is that if you don't have this class, the bourgeoisie, the business class, doesn't seem capable of fulfilling that role. And a bureaucratic military is just too. It really just partakes of the mentality of the bourgeoisie or the bureaucratic mentality, which is not particularly good when it comes to it from what we've seen. And so I'm afraid we're sort of disintegrating it. I've used this expression, the race to the bottom. The communist societies are going to collapse. People have said it. All societies are going to collapse. Like all paper currencies tend toward the value of zero. But the question is now, with how bad it's getting in the Western countries, which is going to collapse first? And in the process of collapse, does one try to save itself by attacking and destroying the other? Does China, as its economy is going into negative growth, is basically starting to decline, do they go to war? Do they blame the United States? Is Russia's war against Ukraine part of this larger animal that we're seeing, that there's a block of countries, used to call it the communist bloc, preparing a larger war? You look at Hamas, you look at Venezuela, Cuba, what's happening in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East, and you go, uh-oh, there is a kind of communist bloc that still exists. Well, it is communist. I mean, China's an outright communist country, and communist parties rule in all these places. And I would argue that really the Communist Party, Soviet Union underground, is still in control of the essential Soviet successor state, right? And they're trying to put piece back the old Union. That's what I think is going on. It's controversial to say that, but the question is that this degeneration, which is connected to the rise of socialism and materialism and hedonism and all these other attending factors, is happening everywhere, along with the decline in honesty, the rise in crime. And it's just if anybody denies that we're decadent and it's getting worse, they're just blind.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I think. Yeah. I think you and I agree that the United States is, in many ways, a declining power. And also, to add more for the sake of the audience, I think you know this already, of course, Jeff. I mean, my view on a hyper-centralized economy of a Nazi, fascist, or communist variety is a prescription problems. Now, one of the strengths that they do have is they have more of a productive base physical economy than we do. But on the other hand, and I was watching a documentary about the old Soviet Union and from the late 1980s, problem is there was no rational way of producing the goods because they never were tailored towards market demands. One of the areas I've been getting really into, I know it's very esoteric, was the history of the various, the Nazi economy as well as their collaborationists. And they had a private economies in theory. and they had a whole swath of nationalized industries or industries of a public character. And one of the things that they were absolutely severely problematic, almost disastrous, was their system of agricultural quotas and price controls on goods. And what happened was, and they brutally enforced it, they had executions, hangings, arrests, labor camps, and everything. The government leaders and the collaborationists, they had their hands in the cookie jar in the black market, particularly in
The Third
Greece.
Reich was incredibly corrupt, by the way. If you
It was
read any
horrible.
memoirs, the corruption was massive, and it was just getting worse by the year.
And I think one of the things that you have in a private economy, and we can debate the degree of laws and economic behaviors, but private economies, number one, this is my observation as a historian or history major, excuse me, as well as just an observer. Number one, you're going to have large groups of people in any given society, I find, that are always going to want to develop products and services and better themselves and better their societies and have entrepreneurial zeal. And it's always going to be there. It's never going to be fully suppressed. Number two, private economies also provide accountability. When you have situations where you can compete, it's going to provide accountability for the best possible goods and services. And when you have market demand being followed, if you will, or met, that's going to, and many economists have argued this on all sides of the spectrum of capitalism, from Ludwig von Mises, who I'm a critic of on certain things and supporter of his and other things, as well as to people like me. It's just, that's what the data indicates to me. And that's why it's one of the many, many different reasons why you have to have a high level of private market transactions in a given economy, because the historical data shows that the hyper-centralized economies, as much as they have this industrial prowess, which in regards to capital goods and productions overshadows our current economy, which works.
I don't think highly centralized economies really have an advantage. I just don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that these economies are overblown. They have the ability to produce a lot of weapons. But malproduction is basically what they do. And they get themselves into trouble, and they go through successive collapses, successive hyperinflations, and the people just live a miserable existence.
Well, and I was about to say that in closing.
Yeah.
They might have that on paper, and yes, it came into use during World War II, but also remember the Soviet front was collapsing in the early months of World War II until obviously the people unified in response to the horrific brutalities and Stalin's iron leadership. But at the end of the day, they don't work. I hate to use the cliche, but it doesn't produce the maximum of human happiness.
Well, no. Well, it doesn't keep. You're going to have, in the long run, you're going to have a society that is ruined economically and socially and morally. It's going to be demoralized. I mean, look at Russian society. The men, their average lifespan is what, 62 years, whatever it is. I think it's gone up, but they have a huge problem with alcoholism. I'm not sure if it's true right now, but for quite a few years, Russia had the largest percentage of heroin addicts in the world. It is a very depressing picture that you get from Russian society. Their birth rate, they tried to raise their birth rate, but it looks like they were faking their numbers. It looks like it's just terrible. And now with the war, people want to leave the country. So, I mean, so you can mismanage your country, especially when it's centralized and you've got this authoritarian state that wants to kind of, the leader of it, Vladimir Putin, thinks that the Soviet Union collapse was the biggest tragedy of the 21st century here, with 2 world wars and the Holocaust and all the horrors that happened in the 20th century. Communism, Soviet Union being one of those horrors. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst tragedy in the 20th century. Just think what a monster Vladimir Putin is to even have that thought. He's certainly not an ignoramus. He's a monster. And so what he's been doing in Ukraine is something that I have been predicting that he would do. I've known that he would do something like that. I know that Xi Jinping is itching to do something like that. Xi Jinping's heroes are Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, the three biggest mass murderers in the world. I've mentioned this before. So the thing is though that the West, which was so strong in being able to hold back the totalitarian flood tide, participated in crushing the Axis, participated in the Cold War, holding back communism. The United States itself is now corrupted. The United States itself is now has a totalitarian virus in it. And I'm not sure they can hold it back. Both the right and the left seem to be infected with different forms of false narratives that are dangerous. I am more and more despondent about the left and the right, and I'm worried that the sensible people on both the right and the left are going to be the ones that are going to lose through this process, and that the crazy people are emerging on both sides.
Right. And that I agree with. I mean, and I'll let you conclude after this final point of mine. I would like to see a left that accepts more capitalism while continuing to realize that it needs checks and balances and rules of the road, and also a sense of patriotism that socialism, totalitarian variants of socialism, is not going to bring liberation to the working class. And I would like to see a right divorce its libertarian and sort of Reaganomics roots, and while upholding the values, the very valid, actually critical values of entrepreneurialism, the nuclear family, and national defense, to have an intellectually coherent doctrine that preserves capitalism against its real pitfalls and self-destructive mechanisms at times when left unchecked, as well as also a devotion to the national defense and to look at the evidence in the hand, not to show for people like Vladimir Putin that Putin is not a Christian, he's not a nationalist, the man is a communist through and through.
Yeah. My one response is the thing I've been sort of on my side going through the wars of religion. The Reformation is almost reenacting itself on my side, because you have these different people with different specific denominations, and I got attacked for quoting Eric Voegelin. Eric Voegelin tried to he wrote a book about the political religions years ago, and he categorized National Socialism and communism as a political religions. He said they're very dangerous, and he's not the only one of the first thinker in the last 100 years to make this kind of observation, although he went deeper and he made it more systematic, and he really made the case for it. And of course, what you get is and so what he did is he created this structure, which is, you have positive faiths, the old religious faiths, and people, what religion are you? Which one are you? And it's like everybody wants their specific kind. No, we're not having religious war. Sorry, put that away. But there are religions where people can build their family and build their society and build their country, as long as there's freedom and there's not religious war. And the thing is, these metastatic faiths, these political religions, where if you murder enough people, you'll have the 1,000-year Reich under the Nazis, or you're going to have the Marxist paradise, the communist paradise. Those are dangerous. And I think that's the biggest, I want to say, with everybody that's warned about totalitarianism, from Hannah Arendt and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, from the right and the left warning about it, that we need to be committed to freedom. We need to be committed to positive structures in society, real religion, real spiritualizing forces that will make people better human beings, where people can look in and say, am I bad? Can I be better? Can I be a better person? Can I, looking at their death and looking at the meaning of life and looking up to God, what are they going to be able to do versus, well, we need to be God, we need to have the state and have all this power, and we need to, make everyone equal, and we need to crush the people who have too much stuff, or the people that are polluting too much, or the people whose skin color is the wrong skin color. So I think that is, Fergelin had this idea, and I think all the right-thinking people of the last 100 years have seen this same thing. But the problem is that people aren't interested in reading. They're not interested in knowing this, and they're not, and so they immediately fall into these narratives that are going to drag them into one of these metastatic faiths.
Well, and it's uncomfortable. What we're talking about is uncomfortable. We're saying basically the Cold War never ended. That's an uncomfortable thing to talk about.
Yes.
That's why I'm trying, like you and others, we're all trying to, I mean, one thing I will say about myself and you all, but on the show, I like to read these quotes because I think otherwise people are going to think you're a kook and they're going to say, well, what's your proof? Well, here's the proof. And I'm saying it as
You've written all kinds of books proving it, really.
I'm sorry?
You've written all kinds of books proving this.
Yeah, but I always have had good professors, and even sometimes my father and others, you know, my mother. I was brought up in such a fashion with whatever professors of all political persuasions say you got to prove yourself, you got to document. I'm a library manager and librarian by profession. You have to document this. And, you know, these forces are, it's all about the revolution. The issue is not the issue, whether the skin, racial justice, and solving all these.
Those are just vehicles for hijacking people, you know, to join up with them.
Yeah, they're not interested. I mean, you have Leonard, I think it was Leonard Patterson and Manning Johnson, who was quoted on your blog recently.
Manning Johnson's, you know, he's forgotten. I mean, my gosh, I wonder, there's no new editions of his books, is there?
No, I think they're available on archive.org, though. You can find them, and I'm sure you could find used copies and get an interlibrary loan.
And there's probably, you know, there's probably online manuscripts of it. You could probably get PDF versions.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, on archive.org. I think that's where I read it, actually, years ago.
And you
they
know,
talk
so
about how the Communist Party and the Comintern and the Soviets exploited the struggle for justice for African Americans.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, see, the thing is, and that's the thing, is that they use a person who's had an unfair situation, whether it's, you know, race or sex or whatever, and they try to leverage that to use them as a sort of a foot soldier in the revolution. Then to find out these people are the worst, these communists are the worst, most dangerous people of all. And so I think we have to somehow pull it together, because we're not winning. Our society is going down the drain.
We have leaders that really just, it's almost like political capitalism and political theater. It's not about fulfilling the public good, and it's not about outflanking our enemies, essentially, and out-strategizing them, and really solving problems to the best of our ability. I mean, I don't believe we could ever achieve a utopia. I've never heard of it.
Oh, no. You better get that out of your head right now. I mean, we're always going to have problems. You got to accept this. We're going to do our best to be just and be good, but that's for you to do in your own soul, and me to do. And then if we all do it together, and we're all conscientious, and we have the freedom to speak, the society has a chance to be decent.
Yeah, well, I mean, for political freedoms in a functioning political system that represents at least partially the will of the people and balance different interests, you know, is very critical for our survival. But, you know, I think you and I would agree that it's been corrupted from a variety of directions, you know.
And the left and the right both need to be focused on freedom. None of this, these people are dangerous over here, we're going to impose our rule on everybody else. None of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, because you can end up with a civil war.
Yeah, and you know, as to what's going on in your website too, as well. I mean, yeah, I saw the different points of view, and I think we just have to be united, because at the end of the day, whether you're Protestant, Lutheran, atheist, or whatever, Jewish, list all the religions, when the Russians and the Chinese arrive, if that is in the cards for them to fulfill their plan, that's all these battles are going to be meaningless. So they're all going to come after our throats if we're non-conforming to their system that they
I mean,
see.
calling each other names because we interpret the Bible differently is not, or that you're Jewish or this person's Catholic or whatever, that is not going to work. I'm sorry. You want to go back to the 15th century and fight and fight a religious civil war, or 1500s, 16th century, fight a religious civil war. Go get a time machine and do it, but don't do it in my country. I don't
Yeah.
want to hear about it. I just want to hear people, we're all united, we're Americans, we want what's best for our country, we're decent people. That's all I want to know.
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
want to get into a Huguenot versus the Catholic, or civil war. I don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and look, you and I have disagreements. Probably people would barely notice, maybe perhaps, but it's done civilly. You bring up your points, I bring up my points passionately but calmly. That's it. Are we going to necessarily change each other's minds on certain things? No. But what brings us together is the fact that we want to see a strong America, a united America. We don't want the Russians and the Chinese to have hegemony in the world. And there are many things we do agree with aside from that too, as well, it seems. And I've learned quite a bit from you, and it's added to my understanding of the world too. I like to absorb things from other people that make sense to me, you know, and that's how it should be. There should be reason, discussion, and everything else. And people can have their freedom to practice their religion. It's a hallmark of our country since its founding. But that's also your blog. If you say, please don't discuss something, this is my opinion.
Good luck with that. Yeah.
Well, it's just, this is how I was brought up. It's like if
Sure.
somebody tells you you're in charge of something, you're walking into somebody's business, and, if you go to the bathroom inside of the business, I'm not saying they're going that
Well,
far, but
if you it's
gotta
very
follow
rude to
certain
come into
rules and
somebody's
respect
house
the business.
and they're a different religion than you are, and to bring up that subject and start picking on them over it, it's pretty rude.
It is.
Sorry.
It is. It's like going on a first date with a woman, and it's like you never go into somebody's house to dinner, as you said, and discuss religion or politics for that
No,
matter. You
you
don't.
got to definitely be careful. I mean, so it's you make an effort, to try to do it right, and you just end
I
up
do give
with
you. I give you a lot of credit though for the very long, well thought out, well written answers. So I think that is very nice that you do that. Not everybody has the patience to do that. So I do give you a lot of credit for doing that, and I respect that. But I hope these folks continue to read your blog. I mean, we all have to be alerted to what's going on and to educate other people. And I think we just have to prepare to as well for possibly what could occur. And
And my last statement for that is that, look, I just want my country defended. I don't want it destroyed. I don't want to see all the people I love killed. I don't want to see my country leveled. That's my motivation. That's just it. That's what. And I know it might happen. And if that happens, I want my country to be able to come out of the rubble, however that's possible. So that's what my motivation for doing all the writing I've done and warning people and talking about it. That's it.
well, the two things that have motivated me to become an anti-communist back in the late 1980s when I was in middle school was reading the book 1984 by George Orwell, who was a democratic socialist, by the way, till his death in 1950, and also watching the movie Red Dawn in Levittown, New York Theater off of Hempstead Turnpike, Route 24. And if you want to know what a world under the hegemony of Russia and China will look like, to quote Orwell's 1984 or O'Brien, imagine a boot stamping on a human face. That is the future that those powers want.
A boot stamping on a human face forever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. I mean, I hate to sound simplistic, but convince me otherwise. Convince me otherwise that their rule will be benign. I'd like to believe that. Well,
It
actually,
won't be.
I don't believe it.
It won't be.
But
Because the only proper
it's,
system for human beings to live under is a system of limited government with checks and balances.
yeah, I'll take that over Russia and China 7 days, including Sundays.
And this is what nearly everyone has forgotten. And I'm just trying to remind people, let's not blow ourselves up.
Well, I think we had a good conversation. We've covered a lot of bases, I think, and I'm glad we got together this week. Thank you especially for your time and your information. And where can people find your works, please?
jrnyquist.blog, and there's articles. I'm working on a series right now, and there's a lot of other videos there too.
Very good. And also, you could find Jeff's books on Amazon.com. I believe they can also order it from you too as well, or no?
I don't really, I'm so busy right now. I don't want to run to the post office all the time, but I'll make announcements if I don't have very many copies of my first book left, so I
Oh.
might want to save them.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And everybody stay safe. God bless. Take care of yourselves. Help take care of others. And we'll see you next week.